restoring and rebuilding Maine's natural biodiversity by planting native wildflowers, shrubs, and trees that support a wide array of wildlife. Dealing with non-native invasives is a part of that. Andrew, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much. How's the audio?
Audience, please.
Great. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight and for having me here. As just mentioned, I grew up just down the road from here, and I've actually been spending the summer back in Topsham. So it's great to be here this evening, talking with you all about a subject that I'm really passionate about. So before I dive in much further, I'll just mention grew up in Topsham full life, and so attended school over at Mount Ararat. Went through, I think we were the first class at the high school to do the CREA program, Cathnance River, and so it's just a wonderful place that I found to be really inspiring to get closer to nature, and I think this town is doing really great things right now. So when I'm not at Maine, right now I'm at Maine Audubon as the program manager of our native plants program, and when I'm not at work, I'm at home. My wife just had our second child back in July, so we have a couple of young kiddos at home. So pretty busy when I'm not at Maine Audubon, but it's all lots of fun. And our 2.5-year-old has already gotten the bug for going out and weeding out invasive plants with in the off hours. So for those of you who don't know, Maine Audubon launched a native plants initiative roughly 9 years ago. And this was originally inspired by a book and a talk that's been given by, at this point, a famed entomologist, Doug Tallian. He wrote the book, Bring Nature Home. So that's what we originally called our program, the Bring Nature Home program. And it's really focused on restoring Maine's natural biodiversity by planting native plants, which support our wildlife. The program began with a small plant sale as a fundraiser roughly 9 years ago, but it's grown extraordinarily following what seemed to be this insatiable appetite for native plants and habitat restoration. So to meet that demand, over the past couple of years, we just finished building the new Ann and Jim Hancock Native Plants Education Center. This is at our headquarters in Falmouth, Maine. And we're thrilled to have this up and running, and it allows us to further expand the educational programs we do, from seed sowing workshops to potting workshops to hosting experts and lecturers from around the state and region. It's really acting as a regional hub for this movement, and couldn't be more excited. When we devised this program, Maine Audubon has always done a ton of education, but our feeling was it would be a little silly to do all this education around the importance of native plants if there's no place for folks to go and buy native plants, because as of 10 years ago, it was really a very limited and small marketplace. So we started a nursery, and this is an image of part of our nursery back in the spring upon completion of the construction project. And in the first plant sale that we did, I think we may have sold a couple hundred plants, and this year we're up to close to 20,000. So it's the scale of just the nursery alone, and our sale effort has been really fun to watch, and that's a big part of my job throughout the growing season. So tonight, the purpose of tonight's talk, so when folks reached out to me about this talk, they asked if I could touch on invasives, and I'm happy to talk about invasives, but whenever I talk about invasive plants, I always want to make sure we're talking about native plants as well, because the two are very much intertwined. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about what invasive species are, their impacts, native plants as the solution, how to manage these plants, then offering up some resources and inspiration to go along with them. And then at the end, I think we can open it up to questions and answers, and hopefully we can have a really nice discussion at that time. So, kick it right off. What's an invasive plant? We were just talking a little bit ago about some misnomers and misconceptions about what is and is not an invasive plant. So an invasive plant, by definition, cannot be a native species. If it's historically found in Maine, it's not invasive. There are native plants that are quite aggressive or vigorous, but they have an ecological role to play. Invasive plants are species whose introduction has caused economic or environmental harm to the environment or human health, which can establish and spread really, really quickly in managed habitats. So we have a long history of non-native plants, and at this point, 30% of plant species found in Maine are non-native. So this is nothing new, although our attention to this subject is certainly growing year after year. So how do these plants get here? 60% deliberately, 11% accidental, and about 30% or so unknown. Those deliberate means of getting here are through things such as horticulture, agriculture, conservation, medicinal. So those are all being so retail nurseries over the years, agriculture and conservation. So in agriculture, a lot of certain shrubby invasive plants were brought over as hedgerows. So they're really good at establishing really quickly and retaining soil. And this was before we knew all the other bad things about them. But many of these species were very much deliberately brought here. And so once they're here, how do they spread? So the number one way is through us and our land use practices. So through development, through the nursery trade, landscaping equipment in general, and then the movement of soil. So we move a lot of soil through our development practices, and that's never going to change. So just recognizing that that's how a lot of things move is important. These plants also move through wildlife. So birds themselves, Maine Audubon is a big proponent of birds. I hope you all know that. And the birds themselves will eat the berries and seeds and other fruit of these invasive species, and they'll spread them throughout the landscape. And then another way is waterways. So some of you may be familiar at this point with the invasives along the Androscoggin. And it's no coincidence. There's a couple things going on there. One, the plants can move in the water itself, being carried downstream. And also waterways are these edge habitats where you have a perfect growing conditions for invasive species, which includes a lot of sunlight and a lot of consistent disturbance. And those are two things that really encourage invasive plants. So just getting into that, why are these plants so successful? Well, there are a couple things going on. There's this one thing called the evolutionary imbalance theory, which is a funny term, but basically there's one thought is that a lot of the invasive species that we find are so successful here in Maine happen to come from East Asia or parts of Asia. And that happens to be an area where some of the plant matter that exists there, it's quite similar to plants that exist here, but they never had an ice age when we did, roughly 10 to 15,000 years ago. And so while the biodiversity that was here was set back at that time, they never got set back. So there's one theory that many of the plants that kept growing there have had that many thousands of years more to keep co-evolving and developing mechanisms that allow them to outcompete plants that are now here. So that's one interesting theory. But the big things that we definitely can pin down are really, it comes down to our land use patterns and actions such as disturbance and fragmentation. So from fragmentation in Maine here, so that means building of towns, developments, so building roadways, new housing developments, what have you, that break up the habitat of the place. This is a white-tailed deer pictured here, and that's a telltale sign of a developed landscape in today's day and age, and a fragmented developed landscape. And one of the ways that I often think about white-tailed deer as an indicator species of a fragmented landscape and an invasive landscape is white-tailed deer often are found in overabundances. They have really, really high populations in fragmented landscapes, and then they are an indicator of ecological imbalances. So this is a picture of an understory that is devoid of native species. And you can see that deer have eaten everything that is palatable to them as far as they can reach. Anything that now grows below that in this particular image are invasives that the deer don't find palatable. So we often see this kind of combination of where if the deer are eating everything, all of the invasives on the understory, eventually the canopy can survive, but eventually the seed bank is depleted and you only have invasives growing back into those areas. So what's the problem with all of this? Number one, I would say is ecological imbalance. So as that past picture showed, it's ecologically just a very unsustainable process at play where we don't, where these plants can outcompete our native plants and they can displace many of the native plants and the animals that are naturally found here. It reduces ecosystem services, harm property values, and believe it or not, there's studies that show where you have an abundance of invasive plants or ecological imbalances, tick populations can explode as well. So before we go too much further into specific invasive plants, I wanted to talk a little bit about the native plants and why they are so important. So when I talk about defining a native plant, rather than give a cookie cutter definition, I like to talk about two specific things, and that is relationship to place and the ecological function. So here in Maine, I would just describe a native plant as something that has been here and evolved for since prior to European colonization of the landscape here. So roughly over 400 to 500 years ago. And that means it's had thousands of years to co-evolve with the other plants and wildlife around them. So the time span matters. The relationship to place is one thing, but I think maybe even more importantly is the ecological function of that plant. So because it's been here for several thousands of years, it's had the time and ability to co-evolve with all of these other organisms in the ecosystem they're found with. So a great example of that is milkweed, the milkweed plant in the Asclepias genus, and the monarch butterfly or the monarch caterpillar as shown here in this picture. And it's a great example because monarch caterpillars can only feed on plants in the milkweed genus, and that's called a host-plant relationship. And milkweed has this milky substance that's toxic to most creatures. It's this defense mechanism, phytochemical defense mechanism of this plant. And monarchs have been able to co-evolve with this plant over thousands of years in a way that allows them to break down this chemical, digest it, and then in turn actually repurpose it to become unpalatable to potential predators. So that's the kind of ecological function that we're talking about, where you have this really complex relationship between wildlife and the landscape. And while that's just one example of a host-plant relationship, there are thousands and thousands of examples of those across the landscape. So it's that kind of ecological complexity and the function that the plant is providing in the landscape. It's just a picture of the butterfly itself on swamp milkweed. Another term I like to throw out there when talking about native plants are keystone species. So keystone species are basically plants that play an outsized role in our ecosystems among native plants. So among native plants, a good example is the oak tree. So trees found in the oak genus are considered to be the #1 keystone species in North America. And the metric they use to base that on are the amount of caterpillars that these trees host. And why do we use caterpillars as a metric? Well, and Doug Tallamy is one of the people who made this really prominent. It's that caterpillars are one of the primary food sources for baby birds. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But other keystone species include things like maple trees, willows, trees and shrubs found in the cherry or plum family. It can include herbaceous species as well, such as asters, goldenrods, etc. And so the point of this is that there are studies that show if you're going to landscape an area, if your aim was purely biodiversity, but you left out most of the keystone species, it would perform far less well than a landscape where the keystone species were really the focal point. And so it just shows that there are certain species that have a much larger impact as far as the food they provide in the food network. So one way to talk about that is this study that was done in 2018 by some graduate students working with Doug Townley that was looking at the Carolina chickadee. So for the sake of this conversation this evening, we could pretend it's the black-capped chickadee, our state bird here in Maine. And what the study did is they were trying to figure out how much of the nesting area needed to be comprised of native plants to sustain the nestlings. And what they found was a nesting pair of chickadees feed their nestlings 400 to 700 caterpillars per day, which amounts to 5,000 to 10,000 caterpillars over 2 weeks. So really extraordinary numbers. If you ever see a bird flying around with multiple caterpillars in its mouth, it's not just being weird, and it's not going to eat those caterpillars itself. It's always going to be bringing those back to its young. A bird would never waste energy carrying food around for itself. And during nesting season, that is what the majority of songbirds are doing. They're seeking out caterpillars to feed their young. And so in order to catch that many caterpillars per day, a nesting pair of chickadees won't leave a 2-acre area. And what they found is that within that 2-acre area, if native plant biomass falls below 70%, it's unsustainable. You cannot sustain a nesting pair of chickadees or songbirds. So think about an area of commercial development where you have a ton of surface parking lot, a lot of impervious surfaces with a handful of maybe street trees, native and non-native alike. But really, it'd be really challenged to get the native plant biomass to be above 70% in that circumstance. I also like to point out, I think for the majority of residential neighborhoods and developments in Maine, most neighborhoods are well above that 70% mark. That's 30% is a good amount of space for developed area. And so we're very fortunate here in Maine that I would say the vast majority of people actually do live in places where you are above that 70% threshold. So I'm going to turn to giving some examples of invasive species in a minute and talking a bit more about how we manage them. But before we do that, as I've been talking about native plants, I wanted to talk about this wonderful resource we have here in Maine through the state of Maine and the Maine Natural Areas Program. A great way to get to know the native species that exist here in Maine is by looking not necessarily at the individual species, but the communities they're part of. Because as I mentioned, one of the places you find lots of invasive species are areas of heavy disturbance where the natural plant communities are no longer intact. So one of the goals here is to try to preserve the natural communities that are intact and minimize disturbances adjacent to them. So this is a great place to go and kind of do some research about what natural plant communities are and where you can find examples of them throughout the state. This is just an example of what one of their fact sheets would look like of an oak pine forest, which is found in abundance in this area. And then just some other examples of eco regions found throughout this area.
Just an aside,
Yeah.
they have just gone to IF&W. It's official. They're not in DACF anymore. They're
great.
in IF&W, and they're called the Ecology Group. I just learned that today when I was trying to figure that out for my agency.
No way.
Yep. So
Okay,
they're under
great.
the ecological review at IF&W. It's official. The website is still up, but it is going to go away. But it'll direct you over there for a while. But
Amazing. And now it's called the Ecology Group?
Yep.
Wonderful. It's a good name. Yeah, so check out not the Maine Natural Areas Program, but the Ecology Group. Now I have a lot of slides to change my slides. So yeah, great. Yeah, that's a great thing. So yeah, great organization, regardless of the name. As I was saying, when it comes to these natural plant communities, there's a term I always like to talk about in when talking about invasives and native plants in developed landscapes. And This photo right here, I think, is a good example of what looks like a natural, but it's not a natural or low impact disturbance. This is a photo I took up in northern Maine of an area that was bogged. And what you see here is a native understory, where a seed bank that was there that is bouncing back, or there could have been a seed mix put down. But the point is this is a logged landscape where it's a pretty intensive disturbance. But you could pretend that maybe this was a fire, or there are a number of things. It's if you have a hurricane and there's large amounts of blowdown, when you have the canopy, which is what you would see in the majority of the state being a closed canopy. If there's an interruption or a disturbance to that canopy, and there's all this sunlight that comes in, a healthy ecosystem has the potential to bounce back like this, whether this is through a healthy seed bank or overall the soils are still healthy enough and intact enough to bounce back. So what you see here are a mix of herbaceous perennials that are some of the first things to come up, such as goldenrods, asters, Joe Pye weed. This is kind of what you'd hope for in an area of intact natural community or close to. And eventually this is basically restarting the process of succession. If left if this was not mowed or disturbed again in the near future, it would eventually go back to a forested landscape. Whereas high impact disturbances, which are often many of our developed landscapes, such as the suburban environments, often don't have the ability to bounce back the way that landscape did. And that's one of the big culprits of that, which Doug Tallamy and much of the native plant movement has focused on, are lawns. And I'm not here to demonize lawns. I love a good lawn. My daughter, Annika, loves running around the lawn with her bare feet. I do too. But we have a lot of lawn and a lot of unused lawn as well. And part of that, I think there are a couple of reasons that we have so much lawn here in the US. We have over 40 million acres of lawn. And when it was originally established, it was a status symbol among the elite, and now it's kind of just become the status quo. And part of the reasons beyond the aesthetics of it and liking the way it looks is it tends to be an economical and an easy way to basically bring the landscape back after a development. Say when a housing development, put in a lawn of non-native Eurasian cool season grass can establish it pretty quickly. And when it comes to soil stabilization, there are great things about that. But what's not great about lawn is basically it's a monoculture of non-native species. And over time, it basically makes it so that this landscape could not bounce back the same way, 2 photos ago was shown. If this were to be let go over time, odds are there things such as invasive species would be the things to outcompete and make this a new home. So ecologically, this is not a very high functioning space. When thinking about that study on the chickadees populations, this would a landscape purely of lawns and ornamental trees would not be able to sustain our songbird populations. And so I'm pointing out lawn as a place of opportunity or also reminding that lawn can be great if used for recreationally, and if you're using it for soccer, parks, those are all great things. But generally, if it's underutilized, it's also a great opportunity to restore with native plants. So before we get into how to restore native plants, we're going to talk a bit more about the invasive plants. So this, hopefully your backyard does not look like this anywhere in Topsham. But this is an example of what it can look like. And again, gonna have to change this slide out now. But this was all from the Maine Natural Areas Program, and it's their invasive plant photo gallery. It's a great resource of almost all of the invasive plants, documented invasive plants found in Maine, along with fact sheets and how to deal with the various plants found in Maine. Another great resource that's come about is IMAP invasives. And if you're doing this kind of work and trying to manage invasives, this is a great citizen science tool to document where you find the invasives, so on and so forth. I think I'll take that moment to also just recognize If you've done much work with managing invasives, it can be very overwhelming. But I also find a lot of hope in the fact that we are at a moment right now where there's never been more attention on the subject than there is now, and there's never been more really cutting edge tools that enable us to address this in a much smarter way, such as IMAP invasives. So a couple of things as far as invasive plant control methods. So these are recommendations through the state, but one, prevent the spread. Identify, so it's all super important to make sure you're IDing the right thing before you rip it out. Prioritize, make sure the priorities are straight as far as where to go after first. Control, monitor, repeat. That's management practices, so always prioritize special habitats, new populations, or isolated populations. And set goals. So that I first want to start by there's a tricky word here, eradicate, which is in many cases not a word to live by with invasive plants, because in general many of these plants we're never going to get rid of entirely. So eradicate is discouraged in many circumstances, but I will make the exception that if you have a new population of a plant, the goal should be to remove it entirely, because that certainly can be doable if you're vigilant and staying on top of a landscape that doesn't currently have anything. So in certain contexts, the goal should be to remove entirely, but generally, depending on the population of the plant, the goal should be to contain the existing footprint, excluding it from currently uninfested areas, or suppressing it to prevent seed production. As far as control methods, non-herbicidal methods there are many. So mechanical, pulling the plants, cutting the plants, manual, smothering, using animals. I know folks who have enlisted the help of goats, and that can be effective in certain contexts. Use of fire in certain landscapes, depending on the scale, can be tricky. Biocontrols, and any number of combinations of these. Speaking of fire, we just actually visited Kennebunk Plains last week. If you've never been, it's an incredible, very rare sandplain grassland environment down in Kennebunk, and it's controlled. It's managed by the Nature Conservancy and controlled using controlled burns. This landscape otherwise would eventually have many more trees and shrubs in it, but through that fire, there's the largest population of northern blazing star, which is a liatris, gorgeous purple flower that's blooming right about now. It's the largest population of that in the world. So if you ever have the chance to get down there, it's a really wonderful landscape. For control methods, things to consider, just talking about this earlier, Mark, but about shoreland zoning. So even if the plants are invasive, if you're in a shoreland zone, you have to consider what the ordinances are about that, because even if you're just removing invasives, that's still a disturbance in a highly sensitive area. Wetland regulations as well. And then always, whenever you're thinking of getting rid of invasives, you want to also have a plan for replanting with natives. Going on to the other kind of control methods of herbicides, which are often combined with some kind of mechanical removal. And it's definitely important here to distinguish between responsible use of herbicides and organic methods. So there are some certainly more responsible methods for specific species, such as cut stem treatment. This is where for certain plants you could cut the plant and then paint an application of herbicide. Basal bark spray versus foliar spray. Foliar spray can be trickier because it can be, that's when things get airborne, and you have to be very careful in those circumstances. I have experience with cut stem, but I don't have experience with much else. So I hesitate from diving too far into the use of herbicides, but it can be a really important tool in certain circumstances. And I'd also mention check in with your local ordinances, because that varies town by town. As far as disposal, I always advocate for leaving on site if possible. depending on the species, but generally, the less you can transport it, the better. For certain things, fruits and seeds, you can bag it. Certain dumps have places to dispose of these, but always check with your local transfer station. So I'm gonna run through some of the invasive plants we have here in Maine and some great native alternatives. Starting with one of the biggest culprits, and that's Asiatic bittersweet. This is one that's found pretty much all over the state. It's been here for a long time. It thrives in these forested edges. I mentioned waterways being a transporter of invasives. This is one that we find on waterways, but also just on the roadsides. It's very prevalent. And as you can see in that picture, it can climb a mature pine tree and cover the whole thing. It's incredible how quickly it can grow. We just had a stand of ash trees at Gilson Farm that died over the past couple of years. In a matter of months, the bittersweet has pretty much climbed to the top of those dead trees. So it can be a big deal. A great alternative is our Virginia creeper. This is a beautiful vine that if you see it growing up a tree, it's not harming that tree. It can grow, it doesn't constrict the tree, it really just grows on the surface. And this is another one that has berries that birds forage in the fall and winter months. And it has this beautiful red foliage in the fall. Autumn olive, this is one of these shrubs. When I mentioned plants that were brought here specifically for agriculture or conservation, autumn olive was one that was brought here intentionally, I think by the government, for hedgerows. And it worked really well, but a little too well, and now it's very prevalent. Great alternative, northern bayberry. So this is autumn olive, super drought tolerant. It can handle very low nutrients, droughty soils, as can bayberry. So this is I like this picture because it shows it growing on the coast of Maine in what is a tiny amount of soil in between all of this bedrock, which to me is a great example of a plant that I want in my landscape because it's practically indestructible. This is a tough one, black swallowwort. This is one of those, if you find it, if it pops up in your landscape, I would try to truly get rid of it, because if it comes in any abundance, it is really, really difficult to get rid of. This one introduced by the nursery trade because it has really beautiful fall foliage, and until relatively recently was still legal to sell in the nursery trade. This is burning bush, so euonymus. It was one of the most popular foundation planting shrubs out there. And so it's still very prevalent amongst the landscape, but it does spread really, really rapidly in disturbed landscapes. I will say, even where I grew up here in Topsham, actually my parents had a couple of these in the front of their house. And it didn't spread for years and years. But once I've messed around and messed things up enough and disturbed that landscape enough over the years, it started to pop up. So the more you are like planting, even just the act of planting things and disturbing the soil, once you give them openings, they'll take it. So the level of disturbance and how intact the natural plant communities are surrounding those plants does matter. If you have really intact natural plant communities, it's harder for these plants to spread.
So has Maine banned it for nursery sales? Delaware did, that's why I'm asking.
Yeah.
Not too recently, they just a couple years ago, they started it.
I believe they have, yeah. Great alternative to burning bush if you want that unmatched fall color is high bush blueberry. This is a wonderful native. You can get berries from it. The wildlife loves it. And it's super hardy. It can grow in a variety of sun and soil conditions. Another one I'd throw out there that there's not a picture of, but is chokeberry. So aronia, whether it's black chokeberry or red chokeberry, those are both really, really beautiful shrubs that have gorgeous late spring flowers and an abundance of berries. This year, for whatever reason, at Gilson Farm, we have a lot of black chokeberry, and it's just loaded with berries. It's really fun.
It's pretty.
Yeah. Garlic mustard. So this is I mentioned a number of shrubs. This is an herbaceous plant that can really, this is one that's particularly found often in areas where you have high deer populations, because they won't eat this plant. And in areas where you have historically high levels of deer disturbance, they'll eat everything else, and this will just take over the forest floor. Glossy buckthorn, another tricky shrub that has these very distinguished for this plant, glossy leaves with black berries, kind of speckled bark. Great alternative to that is nannyberry or some of the viburnums. I find nannyberry viburnum this time of year. This is how you can find the berries out in the wild. It's beautiful blue and pink colors, and in the spring they have this kind of huge white umbrella type blossoms that are just really lovely. Another thing I like about the nannyberry viburnum is they have a fairly upright growth characteristic. So if you have a pathway or some kind of alley that you want to create, it can have a really nice effect in that way. Another one that I've found in many gardens, which if you have a small population, try to dig it out and bag it, and don't. This is one that is I wouldn't encourage even trying to keep on your own property unless you truly can kill it off first, because it spreads through these rhizomes. And the rhizomes, there's so many properties I know of, especially in the Portland area, where everyone has fences, and someone will get rid of it in their yard, but then of course it's in the neighbors, and just every year will just keep coming under the fence. So it's such a tricky one. The variegated variety shown in that bottom photo, really beautiful. It was selected for gardens for many years because it fills in really quickly, and aesthetically quite nice, but ecologically quite damaging. So another tricky one that is also found in areas where you have high populations of deer because they won't eat it, and that's Japanese barberry, and one that is not fun to remove because it has these really sharp thorns that are quite slender and just nasty. Great alternative to that in like droughty landscapes, whether it's shade or sun, Clethra alnifolia, which is also known as summer sweet. It's a really lovely plant that takes a while to get going every spring, but then once it starts blooming, it blooms right through the frost and is a favorite of pollinators. Couple different invasive honeysuckles here. And you have Japanese honeysuckle, which isn't as common, and then there is shrubby honeysuckle, which is Lonicera maroi, and this one is very widespread. Has those distinct red berries, and this is one that I've actually heard a lot of pushback from birders about when there have been big efforts to remove large amounts of this. They've noticed declines in bird populations afterwards because it had replaced everything else. So of course, even if an invasive plant has replaced all of the native plants, wildlife will turn to that plant for food and sustenance and structure, nesting habitat, etc. But it's very surface level because they've shown that many of the fruit found in these plants lack many of the nutrients that our bird species need and our other wildlife need. So it's kind of a candy for birds. It has sugars and things that attracts them and they find tasty, but they're not actually getting what they need from many of these plants. So that's an important thing to note. When you are removing invasives, you are disrupting and disturbing the habitat as it exists, and there will be wildlife that depends on that year to year, but all the more important to replant and replace with natives quickly after removing these, when possible. Some alternatives. So this is more of a ground cover than a larger shrub, but bush honeysuckle, gorgeous ground cover found all over throughout Maine. Thrives in a variety of soil types. Has this really nice yellow flower to it, and the foliage itself is kind of a mix of green and burgundy. So really interesting in a landscape. And then probably one of the most notorious invasives, especially along waterways here in Maine. I know along the Androscoggin or entire islands that are basically full of this, and it's Japanese knotweed. This is one that many of the others we've talked about, you can do a variety of manual or mechanical methods of getting rid of. If you're persistent enough, Japanese knotweed is really hard to get rid of it. Depending on the scale that we're talking about, and especially if you're on a waterway, that's even trickier. But if it's just in your yard or adjacent to your yard, this is a case for making more lawn, actually. I'm often telling people to reduce the size of their lawn, but if you have a population of Japanese knotweed adjacent to your lawn, mow it. Because persistent mowing for a series of years has shown to be effective at reducing this. And pulling, if you have the time and you can be consistent enough, you can remove this plant by you stay on top of it year after year.
That sucks.
Multiflora rose, another tricky one that is definitely spread by birds, because birds do go after these berries. And this was also intentionally brought over by the nursery trade, because it's the flowers are quite beautiful, but once you identify it, you'll start noticing when you're driving up and down the roads, when it's in bloom, it's very prevalent. And also rugosa rose. This is a heartbreaker, because for many folks, it was quite a surprise to learn this is not our native beach rose. It was introduced, but it has been here for a long time, long enough that culturally, it's the rose hips are integrated into a variety of recipes, food recipes. Of indigenous cultures and in older recipe books found throughout Maine. So it's one of these species that's been here for a couple of hundred years anyways. And that's the case with many invasives at this point. They have been here for a long time, to the point where it's culturally a little tricky to talk about removing them, because they have become important in different ways. But in coastal environments, it's a really tricky one. It can take over really sensitive landscapes, and dunescapes in particular are really, really sensitive, especially when we're dealing with things such as sea level rise and more pressures on those landscapes. There are a lot of great alternatives in those kinds of environments, such as their native rose, bayberry, clethra, two I talked about, and then things like seaside goldenrod as well. Then one of our native roses, Virginia rose, that I talk as a great alternative to rugosa rose. One caveat I'll give about this is we worked with the city of South Portland on restoring some of their dunescapes by Willard Beach. If you ever go, it's a great example of replanting a really tricky environment. But one of our requirements that we decided with the city of South Portland was to not use any of the Virginia rose, because the plant itself, maybe not the blossoms, but the plant itself looks very similar to rugosa rose. And if you're trying to manage a landscape with volunteers or rotating staff, where identification of these plants is really important, adding a plant that looks very similar to that invasive is probably not best practice. There's a couple others that I'll give an example. Norway maples is one of the invasive tree species here in Maine that was planted in abundance, especially when elms died off in abundance back in the middle 1900s. And it was a really popular street tree for a variety of reasons. One, it grows really fast, and it seems to be resistant to a lot of diseases and insects. That's the thing with many invasive plants that were selected were because they weren't eaten by anything. None of our insects or wildlife had evolved with them, so they didn't have any reason to eat them. So they seemed like a great resilient tree to put out into the landscape. But unfortunately, Norway maples now will outcompete other canopy species. And then just a couple more. Purple loosestrife, if you have a grassland or if you're trying to create a meadow landscape, this is one that you'd be really better off if you could control that early on, because it spreads really fast. And once you recognize it, you'll see it all over the roadways. We have it in our meadows at Gilson Farm. Again, very beautiful plant, but it displaces many of the other herbaceous meadow species. This is one that does actually respond. If you can have a crew of people going out year after year, cutting back the seed heads, that can be very effective. Cutting and bagging, I'll say. And I have one slide just to like quickly go over. I'm mostly here to talk about invasive plants, but we do have a variety of invasive insects as well that have brought a lot of damage in our across our landscape, from brown-tailed moth. Hemlock woolly adelgid is one that has been killing off a lot of our hemlock trees. The emerald ash borer is probably the most talked about right now because it's been sweeping up through Maine, taking out many of our ash populations. So that's a tricky one to be aware of. Japanese beetles, European fire ants, and jumping worms. So jumping worms is something that I deal with a lot at managing native plant nursery, because that's one that can be moved, spread through the transport of soil, through plants, and other ways through the bulk movement of soils as well. So all things to be aware of, and keep an eye out for. So now that we've just, since we just dove so deep into invasives, which tires me out personally, I like to think about the other side of things and a more ecological approach to the landscape, and something maybe to act as a beacon of hope. So I have a friend and colleague I've worked with in Portland, Maine, who has a little slice of the city, a little backyard that they have restored. And when they moved in, it was just it was all grass, the slivers of landscape that were there. But it's a great example of an ecological ethos to planting heavily developed and historically disturbed landscape. So I'm just going to start out by talking about how they kind of thought about this landscape. It's really a postage stamp lot in downtown Portland, where started out assessing the site, thinking about what are the existing conditions and what are they looking to do. So by assessing the site, they looked at where the sun and shade is, what the soil conditions were, and it was all grass. So it's the great thing again about grass is it's of all things, grass is way easier to replace than invasives. And what they decided to do is they took even one tiny site in a place like in a backyard in Portland, Maine, or side yard can have multiple microclimates. So what I'm showing here is at the bottom of the screen off of the neighboring building, it's a shady area that gets all the runoff of the adjacent building. So that actually is a lot more moist and shady than the rest of the site. So they took what could be like a mesic forest, hardwood forest environment, and took the plants that are found in that kind of plant community and integrated those along that strip. Alternatively, across the driveway, it gets southern sun exposure, and it's very dry, sandy conditions. It doesn't get runoff. So it's a completely different natural plant community in play, and so on and so forth around the property. And the reason I'm using this as an example is when you're thinking about your own landscapes where you live, I think it's really important to recognize how minute these changes can be and how many differences there can be, infinite differences really, in one small landscape, and how when it comes to designing resilient plant communities in our landscape, it takes this kind of attention to detail. Just run through this real quick, but basically the other thing I'll mention is in the back part of this site, where that orange icon is, they did want to have that be kind of instead of lawn, they wanted it to be a gathering area, but the green area behind it was where the fence is. So they wanted to have something established quickly. So rather than selecting one natural plant community for inspiration, they just selected early successional plantings. So think about cherries, birch trees, dogwoods, plants that are some of the first to come up if you were to cut down the canopy. And that is for the purpose of creating really quick screening. I often get the question of what are evergreen alternatives to arborvitae in Maine for providing really fast, like established privacy screens. And my answer is, well, perhaps rather than having to go with an evergreen, which there really aren't a lot of great native choices for compact or dwarf evergreen species in a tight space. Plant almost a hedgerow of these early successional tree species. densely, and that can create a really, really nice privacy barrier. And so I'll give you a few examples of what that looks like in this landscape. Again, this is downtown Portland that's become a bit of a wildlife oasis. I'm not telling all of you to rip up your driveways. My friend here, went a little crazy. That they basically created a path alternative to the driveway where they'll park an extra car here if there's company, but they don't drive with us every day. But to the left is that kind of mesic hardwood forest inspiration, a lot of plants that can thrive in those wetter, shady conditions. Going all the way down to the right, you can see just the abundance of plant material planted densely. What they're doing here is mimicking what happens in natural landscapes. And when you plant like this with density and biodiversity in mind that matches the site characteristics, you're going to have a landscape that's far, far more resilient and resistant to the invasion of invasive plants. So that's really at the heart of what I'm trying to get at here is when we think about the landscapes around where we live, the more you can take inspiration from our natural plant communities, not necessarily replicate them, but be inspired by them. They're going to be that much more resilient. This is just another image of looking down through that space. For the driveway or kind of lawn alternative, outline some of the plants that are found in this environment. So if you're looking for a lawn alternative to the non-native Eurasian cool season grasses that can support a ton of wildlife and also handle a lot of foot traffic. This is a cool mix right here of things. Path rush is one of the things in abundance you find. Here's what the combination of path rush, common violets, wild strawberries, a variety of sedges, poppy oak grass, three-toothed cinquefoil, that's one of my favorite plants, plantain leaf pussy toes, field pussy toes, bluets. So it's really the real point here is when it comes, if you're trying to create a lawn alternative but can handle a good amount of foot traffic, the goal is to create a real matrix of an abundance of different types of plants that can handle different foot traffic at different times of the season. Some of these plants will be up and really at their most vigorous in the early parts of spring, and some of them will be thriving later in the season. So that the function that they play both above ground and below ground through their root structures is really important in this kind of landscape topology. This is also a great mix if you have a path. If you're trying to create paths through your landscape and you don't want to spend a ton of money on hardscape, I often say a green path is a great way to go. And many of these species, I will say, if you one question I get when looking at this plant landscape is you must spend a lot of money to get all these plants in because it's so dense. And it can, but they're also, if you start small, a lot of these plants are really easy to divide and to encourage. So if you just start with one piece, many of these plants are really easily divided and propagated. This is that backspace with the patio with lots of those cherries, dogwoods, birches, and planted around the perimeter to create that really fast screening. And you'll notice all the ground plane here, every inch of soil is covered, which is exactly as you'd find it in most intact plant communities. This is a fun one. So one of my favorite landscapes to plant are one of the more forgotten landscapes, and those are house strips, or the areas in between roads and sidewalks. And one of the ways that he focused on this was in the area where he's replicating kind of a pitch pine dune scape, which you'd find along the coast of Maine, which are really sandy soils that get a lot of salt and a lot of wind. So there are species that naturally take the conditions that are present on sidewalks where you have crews coming through salting every winter. There's plowing that happens. And so these are plants that can handle being chopped right back pretty much every year. It's a mix of things such as bearberry, sedges, wintergreen. The pitch pine there is shown in the middle, flanked by scrub oak, which is actually an oak species we do have here in Topsham as well. It's a really lovely species of oak. So in that #1 keystone species. So if you have a tighter space and you don't have room for a full red oak and it's sandy soils, this is a great choice. We're actually working on a project with the city of Portland this fall on doing a big demonstration landscape of this kind of planting, and we're doing it in partnership with the Parks Conservancy. Partly to give an example of how you can utilize these spaces for native plants, but also in coordination with trying to enhance the canopy with street trees. Because one of the issues that street trees face when planted in these tiny strips of soil between the street and the sidewalk, they face so many pressures, and when they're just covered in turf on top, they're often not getting the nutrients they need that they naturally get where they naturally grow. So we're demonstrating how if you plant ground covers and a variety of kind of a matrix of native plants on top on the ground plane underneath where those street trees grow, it will help with the long-term canopy health as well. And this is just a zoom in of that kind of mesic hardwood forest edge on the shady edge of that driveway, where you have plants that you might never think would grow in a place like downtown Portland, such as trillium or jack in the pulpit, striped maple, so on and so forth. And so just a few other recommendations or examples of if you have areas that you want to plant or replant, really when you're dealing with invasives, always assess the site. Think about what those conditions are, whether it's dry, sunny, a woodland edge, rain garden edge with wetter conditions, and then try to match the plants to those site conditions. And then try to come up with not just one or two species, but a whole matrix of species to fill in for those plants. It's just an example of a few like great native plants for beginners, going from winterberry, serviceberry. If you have a landscape with a lot of deer, it can be really hard to establish plants, but there are a few things that I recommend from native grasses, such as little blue stem. Deer don't go after grasses. And then plants in the mint family. So mountain mints, we have a few different native mountain mints that are really fantastic, as well as wild bergamot or native bee balm. And so think about combos like that. So that's the grass with the blue stem, mountain mints, and wild bergamot, and you're halfway to having a really beautiful and ecologically resilient landscape. So a few final thoughts before I'll run through some resources and turn it over to questions. But biggest thing I can recommend when it comes to habitat restoration is start small. Try to do it in bite-sized pieces. Take the time to observe your landscape, understanding the underlying conditions of that place. Think in layers when restoring a landscape. We'll think back to that visual of a landscape that is taken over from white-tailed deer, where you have the tree layer, but from 5 feet down, nothing else exists. So you really want to fill all those layers. Focus on the ecological function of the place, and just know that landscapes evolve over time, and that we really want to steward that evolution over time. So a few resources that I'll just point out, and I can share this slide, so not to go, and you should probably actually ignore this. Few of these are the ones that are going to be completely new now. But look back to the state's website. IFNW is a wonderful resource. iNaturalist, I hadn't talked about this, but if you haven't used iNaturalist, this is a fantastic citizen science tool where you can see what your neighbors have identified in the place where you live, whether it's a bird species or plant species or an insect. It's a great place to go to identify native conditions of a place. One of my favorite plant keys out there is Go Botany through Native Plant Trust. It's an incredible institution out of Massachusetts, and it shows down to the county level if it's native in Maine. So this is an example of a common winterberry found throughout all the counties in Maine. And then check out our plant finder. So Maine Audubon has a native plant finder where you can look at research plants based on bloom month, sunshade conditions, soil size, wildlife or caterpillars benefited. And we're actually going to be revamping this winter. So stay tuned for changes here. But currently this is what the site looks like. And we have fact sheets for the various plants that exist on our website. And then finally, if you're looking for native plants, we do, as I mentioned, we have our nursery in Falmouth, Maine, where we grow and sell native plants from April through October. We have a festival every June that I encourage you all to check out. But our online sales from April through October at go to mainnativeplants.org. You can find us there with curbside pickups. So hope to see you all down there, and happy to answer any questions you have.
Jackie, when my husband and I moved to Topsham, we,
I think the mic.
sorry, I've got. When my husband and I moved to Topsham, we tried to plant a lot of native plants, but we were buying them from local nurseries. And I have come to, and some of them were chosen by the landscaper. And I've come to realize that we missed a couple of points. One is that sometimes the cultivars probably don't work as well in the landscape as the actual native species. And the other is that really didn't think about layers. So we have a very pretty landscape, I think, but I don't think it's doing what I had hoped it would do. And I'm not sure where to go from there. Is my concern about the cultivars justified?
Yeah, great question. So there are lots of native cultivars, which is a term out there, nativars. And it varies. There's some that have been shown to seem to be perfectly fine and cause minimal ecological disruption. The couple of the issues they found are from if you change the anatomy of the flower, then that can mess with the sexual reproduction potential of that plant and its relationship with pollinators. So pollinators that have co-evolved over thousands of years with a certain plant, once you mess with the anatomy of the flower, that can completely disrupt that relationship. And then that's also one of the other tricky things is if you change the color of the leaves, which is a common thing with certain plants, changing a leaf from, say, green to red or purple. And that can, the leaves are often what certain caterpillars are seeking out to eat, and that can keep wildlife from feeding on those plants. Red and purple are often wildlife will see that as a sign of being toxic, and they'll avoid those species when it comes to leaf color. So those are two things to certainly avoid. Doug Townley was talking about how sometimes there are examples of if you just take, say, a shrub species and make it a dwarf, so a nativar where the size is just altered, that there isn't as much data to show that is a bad thing. But generally, so our nursery, we only focused on wild type or straight species. So the species as they're found in nature, not that have not been edited or changed by the nursery trade or humans for certain attributes. So it varies, but generally that's our approach, to just stick with wild species. And then, oh yeah, what's the question?
Well, let's see. Oh yeah, we have a. Thanks. Oops. John Bloom.
Hi, yes, I got a question.
Like to take your question?
You hear me?
I actually, well, hold on, Sean. I realize we're on mute here.
I can hear you.
All right, yes, we can hear you now, John.
Okay, I take a lot of the vegetation, leaves I rake up and things I prune and weeds I pull over to the Topsham dump where they turn it into compost. And they have a nice sign there that says, please don't put any bamboo in this pile. But I'm wondering about some of the other invasives you mentioned, specifically the garlic mustard. Is that something I should not be putting in the compost pile over at the Topsham dump?
So I'm going to let someone else answer that. But I think there is also a place for invasives. They're separate, but
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Shayna, I'm on the Conservation Commission. And, hi, my name's Shana, I'm on Conservation Commission. I just wanted to let folks know that our town transfer station does have a place for invasive species, which is not in the regular compost pile, but, to the left of the compost dumpster. And it's labeled for invasive species only, and we treat that pile differently. It doesn't go into our compost to spread seed of invasives to other people's yards. So I encourage you to put any invasive plants in that spot. And if you look on the Conservation Commission's webpage through the town website, we have information about invasive species and treatment on there as well. So thank you for that awesome question, and thank you for removing them from your yard, and know that there's a place for them at our town transfer station.
Just a little follow-up. The signage could maybe be improved because it kind of looks like they're focusing on bamboo. And I think there's probably some invasive things which get killed by the composting process, and I have no idea which are which, but
I'm
if
sure
anybody
that's true,
knows, that'd be
but
nice
we
to know.
wanted to make like one spot where everything could go, so people didn't have to worry, and you're right, we need to update our signage, it's been a while.
Okay, thank you.
It's very good compost though.
So we have a rather large patch of Japanese knotweed. And it's surrounding a house that we're gonna be taking down. And one of my thoughts were, when we take the house down, I'll have an excavator over there. To have have the guy with his backhoe, basically paw up, 2 feet or something like that, just go through and disturb that whole thing. Do you think that'll set it back enough to? Any ideas?
I think it might just excite it.
Excited.
Yeah, yeah, I've found, if tilling knotweed, I've seen it just come back stronger than ever, but, so. Yeah, but you're talking about keeping it all on site though, or?
Oh, definitely keeping it on site.
Yeah. I mean. Yeah, I guess theoretically, if it was scooped up and then deposited deep enough, you'd have to go pretty deep, yeah, I think, it depends on the site, but generally I haven't seen that to be effective if it's just being kept there. But I mean, if it's all knocked back, then it'll be easier to keep on top of through other means. And that is a case where surrounding the house, I would say, maybe that's a good time to seed it with some kind of mix that could be mowed regularly for a few years. And then once it's exhausted, it stops popping up, which it will, replant.
Have you heard about the hardware cloth method of killing it?
Yeah, and that's also an option. I find the lawn option to be sometimes just more functional, especially if it's in an area where you're walking a lot. And but yeah, I guess it depends on the space and the context. But yeah, we've targeted at various properties as well.
So kind of add on to that, I'll tell you what I did, and curious your opinion, then I do have a question too, that Japanese knotweed. So we had that on our last property, spent probably 4 or 5 years covering it with tarps, plastic bags, cutting it, injecting it with concentrated, and this was typically based on feedback from people who knew what they were doing, not just me. And what I did find, we cut it in its height. Typically, it would be 8 to 10 feet when I started, and it wouldn't get really above 3-4 feet. Towards the end, I cut it a few times in the summer, and usually I think the fall was when they said was the best time. One of the things that I was told, and I'm curious, because I know you mentioned mowing it, was that even a small piece size of a fingernail basically could regrow. So I'm curious if So when I chose not to mow mine, I cut it with just loppers and bagged it, took care of. Is there any concern with mowing it and then mowing the rest of your lawn and spraying it? Do you think, or is that just kind of?
I generally haven't seen that to be as much of an issue. I think if you had, but it depends also on, if it's like, if you're then mowing over like bare ground, like generally, I don't see that to be an issue, but yeah, the fragments do. Like, that's why, like, if you dig it up with an excavator and it's just ripping apart the fragments, like that tends to just multiply in that way, but.
And in that case, I guess the last thing I'll say is, when I talked to the guy or the folks, he said, unless you excavate the entirety of the soil here, right, nobody's gonna guarantee it. That's for sure, unless you dig down and you find the bottom of it and they go deep. I know I dug at least 2 or 3 feet and they were still going down.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I've heard they can go 7-10 feet down, and I've heard them run culverts 200 feet.
Yeah.
They're awful.
Yeah, and moving soil is incredibly expensive, and that's where I don't find it to be a sustainable practice of trying to dig it out in that way, at least depending on the scale. Like, if you have a patch this big, go for it. But as soon as it's over like 10 square feet, that's a ton of space.
I guess the other thing, I don't know if you're putting a new building there. Okay, as I say, you're putting a new building, maybe don't build a foundation near the knotweed.
Yeah, right.
Okay. No, I was just, that was that,
Yeah.
but you found it.
I actually, so I want to add on to that just a little bit. So behind my house, we had a massive area of knotweed. We have like a wetter area that's kind of forested maples, but in front of it, it was just a huge thing of knotweed. And within like one season, we completely got rid of like 80 to 90% of it. But
How'd you do it?
yes, and so different people will feel different ways about it, but I that won't work for me. We used it was an herbicide, it was a glyphosate, but you use it was a foam based one, and so it's foliar application, and you wait until the fall, and then you go and you spray it just because it's foam based, like leaf by leaf by leaf, so it's not being broadcast into the air, and then you do it. And you have to wait until after it's done flowering. That way it's not putting any chemicals into the flower so that pollinators aren't getting it. And then what happens with the knotweed and why the glyphosate is so effective is that it actually takes the chemical and it pulls it all the way down into the root. And those huge rhizomes for the knotweed, they can go down 8-9 feet into the ground. And so that's why you can like pull and they just keep on putting new stuff up. So we did that, and after the first year, about maybe 80% of it was gone. The second, then we put down tons of native seeds, and we actually got a ton of native plants actually from the Audubon sale. Trying to there. And I will say it's now been about 3 years later. We have almost no knotweed in that spot, and it's covered in New England aster and butterfly milkweed. We have native grasses. Actually, one of the things that really took over that area is jewelweed, which is native, and the bumblebees love it. The hummingbirds are constantly like fighting over it. It's one of the most beautiful areas, totally full of biodiversity right now. And so watching that change over time has been amazing. Just to think that what 3 years ago was completely comprised of just one singular plant with very little benefit, is now just like, it's just exploding with birds and hummingbirds and butterflies and bumblebees. And so it can be done, but I would also say, like, I also, like, I'm not saying that herbicide is the answer, but if you do use it, to use it very carefully and to be aware of everything around it.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect example of where like herbicide is used as an extremely helpful tool, like for this species specifically, because of the way the roots go down so deep, and that foam application, you mentioned is exactly like what folks I know who are in the ecological restoration business will use for huge populations of knotweed in particular. But again, it goes species by species. That's why, yeah. So, but that's super heartening to hear. And yes, but like if you have anything with scale, like sometimes using a tool like that in the beginning to minimize the population, and then through other mechanical and other means, like over time, like it can just make it that much more achievable.
I wish I knew that.
Yeah, I know, 10 years ago.
Other questions?
I have some friends that are considering having a machine come in for the forest edge, which is basically bittersweet vines having taken over everything. And the machine they're thinking of hiring, I've seen pictures. It's an attachment to a bulldozer, and it supposedly chops everything up to tiny little amounts and then leaves it on the ground. Is that likely to work? Again, it's mostly that vine.
So typically when I've seen those kind of grinders used, it's like part of like a multifaceted approach of like that could be like the first step of like accessing the site. Cause like some of these sites that are inundated with bittersweet and honeysuckle and other things that are often grow multiple rows that have been growing amongst each other, it can be like impenetrable almost, so that can be a really effective tool of getting it down, but then fully expecting that it's all going to germinate in abundance once that ground plane is open to the sunlight. So then they'll have to have a plan for what they're going to do next, depending on what the species are present when they all come bouncing back. So, but it can be an effective tool just for accessing the site.
Hi, my name is Don Gower. I'm on the Riverwalk Committee. And one of our big concerns right now is invasive species. Speak to two things that I've noticed we've tried. One was what he just mentioned about using that grinder. The town of Topsham did that 1 or 2 summers ago, all along the Riverwalk. And it was great. We pushed everything back 3 or 4 feet. But now it's back, and it's more invasive probably than ever. One other approach we used on as far as the knotweed, a friend of mine was on Bill Warren was on the committee for the neighborhood association. We were able to knock down some knotweed, which is just, I guess, west of the main park. There was a knoll full of knotweed. So we knocked it down and brought in some soil so that it was smooth enough so we could mow it. And we've been mowing it ever since, and it has taken care of that particular area. So that can work, but you gotta get mowed every 2 or 3 weeks, and you have to make it part of your lawn, which ultimately it'd be nice to have it more native plantings there would be appropriate. Which leads me with the last question I have really is that the committee is looking for some guidance on how to go about this, how to remove what's there. And more importantly, how do we restore it with something that would be appropriate? And it's difficult because CMP owns the land. The dam, get the name, there's a dam owner there involved. And then the town of Topsham has the lease, I think, on the land. And they maintain it with mowing and sort of such. And there's also a sewer line through there, so it's probably, there's no owners and people involved, so we wanna do something, but we don't wanna get any trouble doing it. What we've tried to do so far has been minimally effective, so I don't know if there was get any advice on how we could proceed with that?
Well, it's hard for me to weigh in without much more context or time, but it definitely sounds like a worthwhile endeavor. I know I have so my parents' first house was actually on Bridge Street, and I have very early memories of walking that path and having a praying mantis land on my shoulder. So it's an amazing place, both just the scenery and the ecology that's present there. So it's a worthwhile place to invest the resources in. And I would just say it does seem like one of those places that's the more volunteers you can get to keep on it. I do think like the power of just people to being somewhere year after year makes a difference. I know Portland is doing the same thing with the Eastern Prom. They have a huge friends group and volunteer organization that's taken some ownership of helping to be there and just having eyes on it again, like observing the site on a daily, weekly basis is really helpful. But otherwise, I'd say that just overall management plan can go a long way. Because as you said, just bringing in machinery to cut it back once has short-term gains, but it takes a multi-phase approach.
We have someone online again.
It's me again.
All right, yeah, go ahead, John.
So I walk by that knotweed all the time and I've noticed it for a couple of years. Because it's on the riverbank, I can't imagine mowing it year after year. Are there herbicides? I know on some things that I've cut down, there's a stump killer called triclopyr that you just apply on that one plant where you've cut it and it goes down and kills the roots. Is there anything like that, that's effective on knotweed?
Just the application that you were talking about, the foam application. Yeah.
And actually, so the one that we used, it was based on glyphosate, which glyphosate has a lot of bad press, probably well earned. But yeah, but one of the things about it when used properly, when it goes into the soil, it quickly dissipates and it breaks down into just innocuous different stuff. So it doesn't poison the soil once it goes in. It gets broken down very quickly. And so that's the one that I had used, and I believe that I was at a state fair, I think it was a common ground fair, and there was a state invasives management. I wish I could tell you what I don't remember exactly, but if I could find a link, I would share it. But I believe that was one of the recommended ways of getting rid of it. It was glyphosate, but using again, responsibly. And there are responsible ways of doing it.
Yeah, it's a tricky time to have the discussion because there is so much tension on it now, primarily for its use in agricultural and different trades, even forestry here in Maine. But there's a huge difference between using it for a point source application for an invasive species and weekly, monthly application on millions of acres of soybeans and cereals being grown in the Midwest. So that which is where a lot of the politics come into play. So and they're definitely at this point proven like bad health effects of that used in that kind of scale. So, but it's also important to recognize that it can be a great tool when used correctly.
So along the Riverwalk, there's also a lot of black locust, and I've been known to just take my pruners and cut it down, and then it occurred to me that maybe that's not the best way. Does it come up, send up sprouts around it? Roots?
Black locust is another tricky one. And I don't have as much experience with trying to manage black locust. So I can't speak with much authority on that species. But yeah, it's another one that it certainly will continue to sprout up, but that's where I do think keeping it from further establishing is a good thing. But I think the gold standard would be like having it just be built into a larger comprehensive management plan of the space if possible.
Hi, I'm Stephanie. I co-chair the Energy Committee. Thanks, Andrew, so much for your presentation. Are you willing to share your slide deck or at least some of the resource
Yeah,
slides so that
yeah.
we can post it on the town website
Sure.
for folks to find later?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, and then did we end up recording this session as well?
I believe so.
Okay, so we'll post that on the Energy Committee outreach page on the town website, so folks can find the recording and listen to the valuable information again on demand. So that'll be a great resource for the town and community moving forward.
And I guess it actually we were live streaming it on YouTube, and so we can actually have a link right to that YouTube video.
Great.
So I'm an invasive species from Delaware, no gun colony. And I just wanted to share an experience of what we've been doing there in the woods next to our library in Delaware. We've had spring and fall cutting of burning bush. And we've had a naturalist who came and taught people what it was and what they needed to do and what it looked like. And everybody wanted to plant more things. And the naturalist said, you need to just wait and give it time because the native species are still there and they really have come back. And having this regular group of people who are paying attention and who have the knowledge is really valuable.
Yeah, it's a great story and an example of especially where if you're working in a woodland landscape as opposed to, I think the history of the disturbance of that landscape is really, really important. So understanding what's happened there in the past with the level of disturbance and does it have a chance to bounce back? If it does, observations, everything.
You showed a slide of a clear cut, with the native species coming back. Is it reasonable to assume that most clear cuts would have, because they maybe had been agriculture over one point and then they grew up to forest, that there would still be viable seeds in there?
Yeah, no, definitely. Like that is a great question. It definitely depends on like the historical land use. If the historical land use, if agriculture has been a part of the history of that landscape, but that definitely has huge effects on the soil composition and everything else. So, whereas like many of Maine's northern forests like never had agriculture in abundance. So that would be the big thing. But if the agriculture has been present in the past, like that can really play into that. Or like in the amount of time since it was agriculture, if it was a secondary forest or what have you. Mhm.
Anyone else? Last call.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Yeah. And thanks for the black chokeberry. I've been looking all over